Some 300 years ago in colonial America, there was a very famous minister and preacher named Jonathan Edwards. And in 1741, he preached a sermon which was to become his most famous work. He preached it first at his congregation in Northampton, Massachusetts, and a little bit later, most famously, in Enfield, Connecticut. The name of the sermon was "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And the most famous image from that sermon is of a spider which is over an open flame hanging by a thread. Subsequent generations have found this a very frightening and horrifying image. Robin read for us a moment ago a passage from the Old Testament book of Ruth. Book of Ruth is a very short book, but one which tells an episode which is very important in the biblical history of salvation. That is the story of the way God has been at work in human history to bring about the salvation of humankind. And yet, that salvation of God as we find it in the book of Ruth is hanging by a very thread. There is a family who live in Bethlehem in the land of Judah. The father's name is Elimelech, and the wife's name, or the mother, is Naomi, and they have two sons. And there's a famine in that region. And the narrator tells us that Elimelech decided to take his family to the land of Moab, where they would try to live. Now, Judah, if we can picture in our minds, is on the western side of the Dead Sea, and the land of Moab is on the eastern side. And the Moabites were the enemies of the people of Israel. And the narrator, I think, wants us to see that Elimelech's decision to take his family away from the promised land and the people of God to go and live in another territory amongst the enemies of God's people is meant to be seen as a sign of, shall we say, unfaithfulness, lack of trust in God. The sons come of age, and then they take wives from among the Moabite wisdom. And the law of Israel was very specific, that the people of God were not to intermarry with neighboring nations, especially those who were the enemies of God's people. And we're to see in this intermarriage something which would be perceived as unfaithfulness, lack of trust in God. Years pass, and Elimelech dies. Naomi is a widow. Some more time passes, and both of their sons die. Now Naomi is not only a widow, but she has lost both of her sons. And she starts to tell people that they're not even to call her Naomi anymore. They are to call her something else because she says, "The Lord has dealt bitterly with me." And we're to see in Naomi's despair a kind of unfaithfulness, a lack of trust in God. And yet here is where the miracle happens. A well-known hymn writer has a poem in our hymn book, Natalie Sleeth. And one of her poems says, "In our end is our beginning." Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem in the land of Judah, where she is from. And one of her now widowed daughters-in-law, Ruth, demands to go with her. Ruth says to Naomi, "Your people will be my people, and and your God will be my God. And the two widows arrived in Bethlehem. Naomi was recognized after these many years away. And Ruth, her daughter-in-law, was sort of a stranger. And as you can imagine, two single widowed women in that time and in that place were in rather desperate straits, especially economically. And so Ruth, being young enough and strong enough, went out to look for work. And she found work with a man named Boaz. Boaz was a wealthy relative of Naomi's. And so Ruth would go day after day to Boaz's field, and along with his other servants help with the harvest. Boaz is a righteous man, a good man, a faithful man. And he takes a liking to Ruth. Through a very peculiar set of circumstances, we find in the story of Ruth that Ruth, the heroine, essentially asks Boaz to marry her. Boaz is a righteous man, and not only that, but he's fallen in love with Ruth, and he agrees to marry her. They get married, and then they have a son together, whose name is Obed. Now, when Obed grows up, he had a family of his own, and one of his children was named Jesse. And Jesse then grew up and had a family of his own, and one of his sons was named David. David went on to become king of Israel. And he was not only king of Israel, he was Israel's greatest ever king. And many, many generations after David, we find coming from his family, from his descendants, none other than Jesus of Nazareth. The story of Ruth is an essential moment in the biblical story of God's love and God's salvation of humankind. At the end of the book of Ruth, there is a short genealogy. And the purpose of the genealogy is to show how this story relates to King David, to say where King David came from. At the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, one of the Gospels that tells the story of Jesus' life and ministry, there is a genealogy. And the genealogy which concludes the book of Ruth corresponds precisely, interestingly enough, to that portion of the genealogy as we find it in the Gospel of Matthew. Now I would like to make a comment about this. Many times as we modern people read these lists of names and family histories that we find in the Bible, we find them difficult to understand and frankly boring. But there is a great richness that is being passed on to us through these family histories. And we are to learn so much about the nature of God and God's grace and in whose names have been included. Take, for example, Ruth's family. Ruth's involvement in the history of salvation is unexpected. She is not a Jew. She is not an Israelite. She is a Moabite, a foreigner, outside of God's covenant. Expectedly. And yet she is faithful to God, faithful to God's people. How about Boaz? Boaz's mother was a woman named Rahab. Rahab, some of you may recall, was a prostitute. But Rahab was faithful to God. faithful to God's people. It is unexpected people such as these, misfits in a sense, but faithful misfits, through whom God has chosen to work, whom God has chosen. A few years ago, one of my dad's cousins published a very extensive family tree of the Robertson clan as it has interacted with our family. My dad's mother was a Robertson. It's a very impressive genealogy that my dad's cousin has compiled. It's a very large and thick hardcover book. It contains all kinds of information and lots of photos and personal stories and newspaper clippings and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting for me to look back through this story of our family, or at least this part of my family. And within our family tree are some pretty noteworthy things, some very famous people, so to speak. One of my dad's cousins is a well-known Canadian actor named George R. Robertson. Now, you might not picture who he is just from the name, but if you've ever seen the Police Academy movies, he was the commandant of the Police Academy. And he's been in other more serious works as well. One of our other cousins plays for the Canadian national women's soccer team and has done for the last many years. And in fact, she was the player who scored the goal in the bronze medal game at the London Olympics, which won our team the bronze medal. Well, that's pretty awesome. But there are also other things in our family's history. Sadder things. Mistakes. Moral failures. People who died far too young. In fact, it is very sobering to look back and see the generations of our family summed up in a single volume. Yet somehow, as people of faith, as many of us are in our family, we believe that God is somehow holding it all together. There's something else I'd like to say about the book of Ruth, and that is to say how God is at work not only in the grand story of salvation, but how God is at work in special and particular ways among his people. Naomi, towards the beginning of the story of Ruth, is in despair, and understandably so. She has lost her husband and then her two sons, and she decides to go back to Bethlehem in the land of Judah, where she's come from originally. And at first, both of her widowed daughters-in-law offered to go with her. And Naomi said to them, "Do I have other sons for you to marry? Even if I were to have a husband tonight, and I was to get pregnant, would you wait for my sons to be born, and then to grow up that you might marry them?" Well, we know what happened. Ruth demanded to go back, and Ruth did find a husband in Bethlehem named Boaz, and they had together a son named Obed. And when Obed was a little baby, the narrator tells us that Naomi, his grandma, took him in his arms and held him close. And you know what the women of Bethlehem said? It's like Naomi has a son. Naomi was not always brilliant in her faithfulness to God, but God was certainly faithful to her. And many of us experience times of great difficulty in our lives. More difficult than for Naomi? Many times we have difficulty trusting in God. Times we may even get angry with God. Angrier than Naomi? We are not always faithful to God, at least not as we should be. God is faithful to us. I spoke at the outset of a famous sermon by Jonathan Edwards. I should say that his sermon is infamous rather than famous. You know that image he described of a spider hanging by a thread over the open flame? Most people misunderstand this image. The spider is not being dangled, but rescued, held, prevented from falling. No matter how things seem, God is holding us in love. Thanks and praise be to God.